Hello and welcome to today's webinar WIEF thinkTALK series. Marks the first edition of 2021, entitled SME Trends, Disruptive Innovations Impacting SMEs. Now, let's welcome our first Mocha Fest pop-up of the year. Enda and Ressa is a duo musician team from Indonesia. They started their career in 2004, and their musical nuance that they aim to bring out is folk, jazz, blues, rock and roll, and ballads. To date, they have released 5 albums, with their first titled Nowhere to Go in 2009. Without further ado, please welcome Enda and Ressa.
Hi everyone, we are Enda and Reza from Indonesia, and we are here to play our original song for you. This song called Slow. Yeah, we write the song during pandemic, and it's about to enjoy this slow time that we are experiencing together for a year, surprisingly. And this is really wonderful experience to play and perform in WIEF, and enjoy the show. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So this song mentioning the title of popular song in the era. So maybe you can guess, and maybe you have a favorite song that we mention in this song. And enjoy thinkTALK series 2021 with Ibrahim Patel, Charlotte Khan, and Joel Shannon. Of course, we are Enda and Ressa. Hope you enjoy today. Have a nice day. Yeah, this is slow. Yo. Everything is slow, and I can see clearly now. Time after time, I don't wanna miss a thing. So please stand by me all night long and take on me one more night. I see 3 little birds here, there, and everywhere. Is this the end of the road? I'm knocking on heaven's door. So please stand by me all night long and take on me one more night. You ought to know, when you love someone, you got to let it go. But my heart will go on close to you. So please stand by me all night long and take on me one more night. So please stand by me all night long and take on me one more night. Oh yeah, one more night. Oh, all night long. Everything is slow, yeah. We are Enda and Ressa. so much. We love you.
Thank you both, Enda and Ressa, for the wonderful performance. Up next, we have our opening remarks from the chairman of WIEF Young Leaders Network. He is also the managing director of Sia Coca Technologies, all the way from South Africa. Please welcome Ibrahim Patel.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. And after that wonderful performance by Enda and Reza, it's very difficult for us to have an opening remark. But the past year has given us so much to reflect on. It's shown us the resilience of humans, the strength that we have within us. And as the song said, it's given us the time to slow down and think a lot more clearly. And as we emerge from this time of global pandemic and this time of where the economy has been totally devastated, we emerge with this hope that things have changed and we will also rise with the tide. What has created a great deal of focus is how companies remained resilient. Those that had adopted disruptive technology and innovation showed their resilience when the economies had closed. And so in keeping with this trend of global change, the WIEF, the World Islamic Economic Forum, as an organization, has also adapted to the changes that have taken place in the world. Part of this has been how do we reach out and continue our programs. And digitalization has become a huge foundation of every organization and every business. Digitalization is not just a trend, it is a necessary tool for digital transformation that adapts and the ways of doing business onto digital platforms. Therefore, businesses are able to create value, produce opportunities such as new revenue streams, and thrive in the 21st century as well as beyond. They can adapt to the change in consumer behavior. They're adapting to the way the business environment has changed. The current economic climate as well as the pandemic, these are the catalysts that heightened the urgency for digital transformation. But these innovative transformation and innovative technology has always been there. Who would have thought that working from home has become normal? At one stage, we all fought for the opportunity to work from home. Now work from home has become, and companies are adapting to the need for the workforce to work from home. These transformations are necessary for businesses to continue. And those businesses that harness the digital innovation will become resilient and will grow past the pandemic. With that in mind, the 2021 initiatives by the WIEF foundations are designed to assist and inspire businesses to speed up the process of digitalization. So this year, the WIEF has adopted this as a theme across all its programs. Digitalization has become the central focus of the themes. And it's because digitalization is the heart of economic recovery that we have chosen this particular theme. It fills the gap for so many societies as the tool for economic growth and is a guide of how businesses can recover. So instead of waiting for recovery to take place, it is businesses that will be driving their own recovery that will be able to survive. And those businesses and societies that can adopt digital transformation and digitalization are the ones that will build resilience within them. So in keeping with the overall theme of the WIEF digitalization this year, the WI and the Young Leaders Network has adopted the same theme throughout all our programs. This year, we are organizing 6 webinar sessions comprising of 5 discussion sessions and 1 training session throughout the year. The discussion sessions, which are known as thinkTALK and Mock Affairs, of which this is the first edition, are catered for entrepreneurs and startups, including those in the arts and the creative arts, to serve as a recovery and a guide through the pandemic crisis. These sessions are respectively designed to help entrepreneurs and SMEs and startups to uncover opportunities for innovation, different funding avenues through fintech and crypto, new business opportunities, as well as how they can achieve competitive advantage through AI and machine language. At the end of the year, the discussions will be translated into a training program entitled Jumpstart. This is an exciting innovation for us. Jumpstart is a 2-day entrepreneurship training program that aims to spur the disruptive innovation capacity of young entrepreneurial hopefuls. The program empowers entrepreneurs with essential skills for them to create a viable or to create viable business ideas that have a higher chance of succeeding in the contemporary digital marketing sales funnel. The program structures include workshops, discussions, and teamwork. The workshop modules comprise of digital value proposition, minimum viable product, market validation, and all of these wonderful things. You will be happy to note that we're including gaming as well as part of our theme, because this is an exciting way in which the world has transformed. And gaming is no longer about entertainment. It's now become a mainstream business. So we would be incorporating various exciting ideas into our programs. And I'm really, really excited about the year forward, that we would be reaching out and running our programs. And at the end of the year, we hope to see all of you in our Jumpstart. With those few words, thank you very much. I hope you have a fantastic event today. We have some great speakers. Joel Shern, I'm honored to have Joel Shern on board and Charlotte to be moderating the session, and we will really be learning from their wisdom and from their experiences. With those few words, great luck and great success for the year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim Patel. Now, for the highlight of the session, I would like to introduce our moderator, Charlotte Khan. She is the international print and broadcast journalist based in London. Over to you, Charlotte.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us, and welcome to this webinar on the disruptive innovations impacting SMEs. I'm very happy to be joined today by Joel Shen. He's Vice Chairman of the Singapore Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia and a partner in the corporate team at Withers Cater Wong, a leading expert in fintech. Hello, Joel. Very nice to have you on board for the discussion.
Hello, Charlotte. Hello, everyone. It's very good to be here and to be joining all of you today on a bright and sunny afternoon in Jakarta, where I'm dialing in from. How are you today, Charlotte?
Pretty sunny here in London as well, where I'm based. And this shows how global, obviously, the forum is and its outreach. So, Joel, we're here to talk about the disruptive technologies that will change the game for SMEs. Let me give you a little bit of background to start with, of course, because as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has brutally hit the prosperity and prospects of many businesses, but especially SMEs and startups. The pandemic has indeed put smaller businesses under tremendous financial pressure and forced them to come up with creative solutions to stay in business. This crisis has basically served as a call to action for further digitalization, with SMEs having to capitalize on consumers' digital footprint for business engagement. So, Joel, like I was pointing to, at the moment, what the main insight, I reckon, of this crisis is the fact that digitalization is a must-do. I mean, it's basically accelerated the case for it.
Yes, absolutely, Charlotte. That's quite right. And on this point, I'd like to make two observations, both of which were highlighted in a report that was jointly issued by Bain & Company, Google, and Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund Temasek on the digital economy in Southeast Asia, where I'm based. Now, this has been a report that they've published since 2015, and in the latest iteration of the report in 2020, the publishers made two key observations. The first is that the Southeast Asian, the number of internet users in Southeast Asia had increased by 40 million. Charlotte, and to put things in perspective for you, it was 360 million in 2019 and a bump of 40 million in 2020 to bring the number up to 400 million. So as at last year, 70% of all residents in Southeast Asia were connected to the internet. The second observation that these researchers had made was that out of all of the people who had consumed any goods or services via the internet last year, 36%, so slightly over a third of them, had done it for the first time. So if you're, so 1 in 3 users in Southeast Asia who had hailed a ride or ordered takeout or booked an appointment at the doctors, or seen or ordered prescription medicines over the internet, a third of them had done it for the first time last year. As an extension to this point, I would go further on to say that out of those surveyed, 94% of everyone who had used the internet to consume goods and services last year envisage themselves doing this post-pandemic. So coming back to your earlier point, Charlotte, it's absolutely clear, certainly from where I'm standing, that the pandemic, whilst it has been an extraordinarily challenging and difficult time for everyone across the world, has accelerated the adoption of digital technologies by consumers and businesses alike in a permanent way, and that this change is expected to last post-pandemic, both in Southeast Asia, and I would go as far to venture across the world generally.
I think you've made a very interesting point here with the number of internet users increasing. Before we even discuss disruptive technologies, connectivity is a prerequisite, isn't it? It's very important that governments and the private sector should combine their efforts to offer greater connectivity to the whole planet.
Yes, absolutely, that's right. And there is no talk, of course, of digital technologies without the assumption of certain underlying infrastructure. We assume that the proliferation of digital technologies assumes that underlying infrastructure such as smartphones, such as digital telecommunications networks, such as even basic things like electrical supply are available. And of course, these are public goods, Charlotte, that are best provided by states. In addition to that, and this is of course something that you'll be well aware of, sitting in London, one of the financial centers of the world, there's been an extraordinary amount of private capital pouring in to finance the development of new and disruptive technologies as well, notably in the form of venture capital. Again, in Southeast Asia, where I am, the 3 years leading up to the pandemic were record fundraising years for Southeast Asian focused venture capital investors. Again, I would extend that theme more generally across the world, and certainly where Withers, my law firm, is based, we see a spike in activity from Western Europe to North America to Greater China, where where Withers have got a significant presence.
The role of the private sector, whether it's private equity investments, venture funds, cannot be underplayed here. It's very important in order to speed up digitalization that they should also get involved.
Yes, absolutely. That's certainly the reason why all the VCs are out in force. They're all looking for the next big venture to back. Already venture capital and private funding has, certainly in my part of the world, given rise to a new generation of digital businesses, from ride-hailing applications to food delivery to online digital payments to even the OTT delivery of essential services like education and healthcare services. This has changed the economic landscape as we know it in Southeast Asia, and I would suggest the rest of the world as well. And it was quite opportune that the advent of these technologies had come at a time, or that the pandemic rather had come at a time when these technologies were already in existence. I always mention when commiserating about the pandemic and its disproportionate effects on the developing world, can you imagine how things would have panned out if the pandemic had come as recently as 20 years ago, where perhaps some of these technologies were not as prolific as they are today? If you imagine that the pandemic had come at a time where it would not have been possible for children to have home-based learning, for example, or for the infirm to see their doctors via telemedicine applications, or to receive prescription drugs, or for prescription drugs or essential goods such as food and other items to be delivered via delivery applications. Now, I think the global response to the pandemic would have been very different.
Absolutely. So what does digitalization looks like for SMEs? I mean, we're talking about it a lot, but how do you go about it? How do you do it? What should be the first steps? I mean, it sounds like this big thing, doesn't it? Digitalization, like invest in IT infrastructure, you know, get onto the cloud and so on. But really, it sounds to me that all it takes is this to start with, okay? Your smartphone.
Yes, absolutely, Charlotte. Now, one example I always say when people ask me what digitalization looks like is I say, look no further than your favorite food stall in Singapore. Now, the example I personally use, and my personal favorite, is this little stall in a dingy basement in a grade C office building in downtown Singapore. It's run by a septuagenarian Singaporean Chinese lady, and it sells fried bihun or rice noodles. All right, delicious breakfast food, beloved by Singaporean office workers everywhere. She has been around as long as I can remember. Certainly 15 years ago when I started practice in Singapore, I've been patronizing her stall. She's assisted by a number of whom I can only assume are family members or friends, and she sells every day from the early hours of the morning until her bihun sells out round about 10:30 every day. Okay. It's a very traditional business, as traditional as they come. She takes her money in physical currency and counts out your change in the same. Now, this business, I'm happy to report, has responded to the pandemic by doing exactly as you just said, Charlotte. They've adapted and they've leveraged on existing digital platforms and digital technologies to ensure that their business continues to operate and continues to generate revenue in a time of the pandemic when when countries go into lockdown and officers institute work from home arrangements. This septuagenarian food stall auntie nevertheless continues to ensure through the use of digital technologies that her delicious and nourishing bihun nourishes the hearts and the bodies of office workers in Singapore.
Joel, before we pursue this discussion, I'd like to invite the audience to send their questions by using the chat box at your disposal, the Q&A box, sorry. So please feel free to send us your questions so we can discuss during this webinar. And of course, it's just popped up on my screen as well. We have a poll. Okay, so you can answer some questions to help, orientate the debate as you wish. Okay, Joel, we've just been talking about how this lady has used an application, to ensure she can carry on, offer her services. What about payments, digital payments? That's been also very important, and that has developed massively during the pandemic, hasn't it? You're a fintech expert, so tell us all about it.
Digital payment, Charlotte, is one of the bright spots in the economy at the moment. Now, you're in London, of course, one of the leading financial hubs of the world, where the fintech sector, which is well ahead of the curve when it comes to financial technologies. I'm based in Singapore for the most part, which is a very similar model to London and is a good breeding ground for financial technologies as well. But I consider it an interesting juxtaposition to financial hubs like London and Singapore. Markets like Indonesia. Now, Indonesia, Charlotte, is a country of 270 million people. It's the largest archipelagic country in the world, and from coast to coast spans or from east to west spans the distance from London to Baghdad. It comprises 17,000 islands, many of which would not have even basic infrastructure. 52% of all Indonesian adults are unbanked, by which I mean they have no bank account. And of the remaining, about 47% have inadequate access, are underbanked, by which I mean they have inadequate access to even basic financial products and services such as insurance, credit, small business loans, etc. So financial technology, Charlotte, is bridging the gap, if you will, and democratizing the world of finance, so that not only the top 1% of users in a country like Indonesia have access to these financial products and services, but ensuring in a world where the distribution and the reach of traditional banks is limited, whether by geography or by lack of infrastructure, ensuring that in a market like that, even the fat bottom of the demographic pyramid continues to have access to these very basic financial services.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that a lot of SMEs are involved in commerce, generally, trade, e-commerce in particular. So the development of fintech solutions appropriate for them is key, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I would go as far to say that fintech is one of the, you make a good point that e-commerce is growing at a meteoric pace, but e-commerce doesn't develop in a vacuum, Charlotte. I'd go as far to say that fintech or digital payments technology is one of the two pillars that supports the development of e-commerce. The other, of course, being logistics. You know, it's no good. I'll give you a funny example. There is, Jakarta plays host to one of the most underrated jazz festivals in the Southern Hemisphere. And I'm a big fan of jazz and have been attending this Java Jazz Festival now for nigh on a decade, okay? And it used to be the case that I would have to buy a physical ticket from a little tour operator and I'll have to pay them in cash. And I'll then have to take my ticket down to the concert venue. It's all a very brick and mortar process. These days, of course, I get my ticket online. It's actually a little QR code on my screen. I pay through a digital application. I scan the QR code at the entrance to the festival grounds. I go in. Any food that I consume or any memorabilia that I purchase on the festival grounds, I pay for in using either a digital payments application or a credit or a digital or an e-wallet that's tethered to a credit card or to a debit card. These technologies seem ubiquitous today, but they didn't exist as recently as 10 years ago in a place like Indonesia. So you're absolutely right. Financial services is one of the key pillars that supports the continued development of e-commerce as we know it.
You've made a very interesting point here. I mean, I've mentioned that through the use of an application on your phone, you literally have access to the global market, which sounds great, but indeed you need the logistics, you need the structure behind it to make it work. I mean, if you need to, if you're doing business, if you're based in Asia, you're doing business with Africa, you need to ship your goods, you know, to Africa. Obviously, a lot of trade is done through services, but if we're talking about physical goods, you need that infrastructure as well. So when we're talking about digitalization and innovative technologies, let's not forget the supporting infrastructure and physical infrastructure that is needed behind it.
Quite so, quite so. Now, one looks no further at the recent developments in the Suez Canal of this week that has caused much concern and consternation across the world. Government leaders have come out to say that we should be expecting drawdowns on existing inventory simply because the trade routes have been so disrupted by an accident that nobody foresaw. Now, when talking about digitalization and the use of digital technologies and the adoption of digital technologies by SMEs, one can't forget, of course, that SMEs exist and trade and do business in a very real world, and that at the end of the day, it's physical goods for the most part, or services that need to be delivered.
Absolutely. So we have been sent some questions. An interesting one here, because we were talking about fintech earlier on. Will fintech eventually replace banks?
Well, it depends on your view of the world, I think. I don't think banks will ever be totally replaced, simply because banks themselves are constantly evolving. I wouldn't see fintechs and banks as being on two ends of a competing spectrum. I would see fintechs as developers of new technologies that are eventually either sold to banks or assimilated by banks, or indeed developed by banks themselves. If you look at some of the banks, the largest banks in Southeast Asia today, these are the leading lights in fintech development and have developed in-house technologies, again, that we would consider to be ubiquitous today. I'm sure this is the case in the UK. As I said, London is one of the financial centers of the world, and the UK, I would suggest, is leading the pack in terms of fintech development. So don't think of fintechs as being upstart disruptors to slow and cumbersome banks, but rather think of fintech as being an alternative, just in a different business than banks. A bit closer, using an example that's slightly closer to home, I'm often asked whether the use of AI technologies will eventually displace lawyers, because nobody likes to pay an expensive lawyer to tell them things they already know. But given the rise of artificial intelligence and chatbots and perhaps AI and applications of documentation and discovery and the use of smart contracts, do I foresee, I'm sometimes asked, the demise of the law firm as we know it today? And the answer, of course, is, well, the legal profession, much like banks, has been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. If you asked a senior lawyer today, if you asked a senior lawyer today to describe to you the law firm that he'd worked in the days of his youth, you'll find that it's an entirely different place than it is today. The cutting edge technologies of the time were things like secretarial typing pools and Xerox technologies and dictaphones and microfiche. None of which words a post-millennial audience will understand today, but all of which were ubiquitous technologies on which law firms operated as recently as 30 years ago. Now, I would suggest the same is true for banks as well. Many of the technologies employed by banks today would not have been in existence 30 or 40 years ago, and these are technologies that are either developed by the banks themselves or assimilated by the banks through the acquisition of these fintech developers.
Thank you, Joel. AI is indeed a way to augment the human and help us get rid of those manual repetitive tasks. But there are great concerns out there that it will replace human labor somehow, but it will not. It's going to cohabit alongside, workers to help enhance them and make their work more interesting. Well, that's the positive spin on it, I guess. But, the point is AI cannot replace human creativity and the human touch, really.
Quite so. Now, I think writers of science fiction have been purveying this view for the last 100 years, Charlotte, that technology will eventually displace the human worker. They've been saying this as far back as the Industrial Revolution, that once factories eventually become fully automated, there will be no longer any use for the proletariat. I don't know whether it's a happy or a sad thing for me to report, Charlotte, that 100 years after, or hundreds of years after the Industrial Revolution, we continue to find ourselves working a 5-day work week, and nobody suggested to me in the slightest that I might be relieved of my professional duties anytime soon. So the worst that has been the worst expectations have not come to pass. I don't think the development of technologies today will change any of that. The human beings are an extremely adaptable and resilient race, and I'm sure we'll find things to keep ourselves busy even after AI technologies become more sophisticated.
Okay, so we've discussed AI and fintech, digital payments, for instance. What other technologies out there excite you about their potential to transform SMEs?
Well, rather than exploring these,
a lot. There's a lot of talk about blockchain and its potential to revolutionize transactions by enhancing traceability, visibility, and cooperation. What do you make of that? And how can it help SMEs?
Now, absolutely, blockchains. Blockchains are, as you say, a technology for decentralized functions have historically been centralized. The most common applications for blockchains are in these digital currencies, or these cryptocurrencies that we hear a lot of today, certainly when Bitcoin is trading at all-time highs of $50,000 US. Now, I think I would view blockchain technologies as just one of a growing breed of new tools that are used by SMEs. Rather than exploring these technologies in a vacuum, Charlotte, I'd like to identify one of the discussions I think I might like to have is the sectors or the verticals in which SMEs or traditional actors might be employing technologies. Now, in a country like Indonesia, for example, the greatest gaps in the delivery of services, in addition to financial services, which we've already talked about, is the delivery of educational and healthcare services. So, for example, one of the consequences of the pandemic, and Charlotte, you're a mother of a school-going child, so you would no doubt fully empathize with this, is that an entire generation of students has had to study from home because it's not been feasible, because schools have had to close in the lockdowns associated with the pandemic. Now, again, if the pandemic had happened as recently as 20 to 30 years ago, these children might have seen a lost semester or a lost year in education. But because of the proliferation of mobile technologies and communications technologies, the school-going children in our families continue to have access to education throughout the pandemic. Is any one technology responsible for these? Are we able to point to something like blockchain or financial technology or financial technologies as being responsible for this happy state of affairs? I wouldn't suggest that it's any one thing. I would, however, suggest that it's the aggregation of the available technologies that we have today that have resulted in this happy coincidence. A similar example, I think, Charlotte, can be made of the delivery of healthcare services. Now, if the pandemic were to have happened 30 years ago, what would happen, for example, to people who needed to make regular trips to the hospital or to the clinics? Physical checkups would no longer be feasible. The collection of prescription drugs would no longer be feasible. However, with the advent of technologies like telemedicine, with the advent of delivery platforms, we now find ourselves able to consult with our medical practitioners over over the internet today, and to be able to procure these medications, which are then delivered to our house. And again, is it just the one technology, or is it just the one development that has led to this? No, I would suggest, Charlotte, it's an accumulation of different technologies, all deployed in various functions, that have led to this happy state of affairs.
There's a lot out there indeed. And I think what's interesting is the fact that, unlike large corporates and big structures, it's much easier for SMEs to try new things, change their business models, adopt new technologies. They have that great advantage. Of course, they have great disadvantage for other things, but they have that agility, flexibility, nimble nature that is a massive strength, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I would totally echo your views there. When people think of a country like Indonesia, where I'm based, there is a temptation to think of large state-owned companies or large listed conglomerates, mostly dealing in fast-moving consumer goods or the extractive industries. However, the Indonesian economy, most of the Indonesian economy comprises of SMEs, really everyone from a mom and pop shop selling groceries, or food stalls, or medium enterprises in the manufacture of extrusion plastics or screws, all of those industries that keep a good and great country like Indonesia trundling along. These small and medium enterprises, Charlotte, as you've correctly pointed out, have a distinct advantage in their small size and nimbleness compared to larger enterprises. It's much easier for these small businesses to adapt to new technologies. It's far easier for these businesses to pivot when they come against roadblocks or speed bumps, such as those that the pandemic have presented. They're far more adaptable. The Indonesian people, Charlotte, are an extremely resilient people. They're an extremely optimistic people, and I would extend those observations also to the small and medium Indonesian businesses. Now, again, this is true of Indonesia, but I would make those observations also of the developing world generally. Now, we do quite most of the work that we do out of Withers in Singapore has a Southeast Asian angle, and WIEF itself is headquartered in Malaysia. And just looking at how Malaysian or Vietnamese or Filipino businesses have adapted and pivoted and adopted new technologies and source for new sources of revenue over the pandemic, is just such an incredible testament, Charlotte, to the continued resilience and resourcefulness of these businesses.
Absolutely. Now, we've been asked a very interesting question. What about digital talents? I mean, as we know, we are in a sort of talent war, a global one, by the way. And there's a shortage. We've got a shortage of digital skills, we know that, and we need more programmers, data scientists, DevOps, and so on, So isn't that a crucial gap, especially in the developing world? As we know, a lot of mature economies are attracting all this talent that comes from the developing world. So what can we do to A, grow local talent, B, retain it, and C, do it within SMEs without the, the 6 or 7 figure salary?
You're absolutely right, Charlotte. You described it as a war for talent, and it is exactly that. All right, Charlotte. I was talking to a recruitment agency with whom I sometimes work the other day, and they said, you know what the average lifespan is of a CTO or a senior VP in technology in Indonesia these days? And I said, it must be something like a year. And they said, no, it's 7 months. So if you're a CTO, or if you're a senior VP or some senior executive with a tech background, background in any of the fields, specializing in any of the fields that you just described, your average lifespan in an employer is 7 months, and you then move on to greener pastures with a nice and healthy pay rise. Now, of course, this is unsustainable for the industry, and would only slow down, I think, the progress of the technological economy in Southeast Asia and indeed across the world. What can we do about it? Well, there isn't a simple solution, Charlotte. Education is one obvious answer to these problems, but education, as you know, it takes a long time to train a data scientist. It takes a long, the gestation period for some of these disciplines would be many years, Charlotte. And, you know, if I enrolled to be trained in a tertiary institution as a data scientist today, well, the world might be a different place by the time I graduated. So I think we do need to adopt newer ways of looking at education rather than, you know, in the way that we saw it perhaps as recently as 1 or 2 decades ago, where you kind of did your degree at the end of the education and you're ready for the workplace, and that's what you do until the day you retire. So I think education today needs to be a much longer process over the lifetime or over the productive lifetime of a typical employee. So we need to constantly renew ourselves. We need to constantly educate ourselves. Many of these opportunities are in the technological sector. We see that, again, there's not many good things to have come out of the pandemic, but the pandemic has shut down entire industries. So things like hospitality industry or point-to-point travel or international travel are now operating at single percentage points of what they used to just prior to the pandemic. But what this means is it's also freed up an extraordinary supply of talent, which can be redeployed and which has over the last 12 months, some of which has over the last 12 months been looking to be redeployed in areas that are in all the areas that we just described earlier, Charlotte.
Joel, we asked questions about how SMEs can afford disruptive innovations in order to thrive. What can they do? I mean, they are operating on a tiny budget, if any. So what advice would you give them?
Well, consider what the alternative is to adapting. Using the example that I used earlier of that bihun stall in a basement of a Singapore commercial building. If she had not adapted to new technologies, if the proprietress had not put herself on a food delivery app or started accepting payments by digital wallets, where would that business be today? Would she have, for example, weathered the many months during which Singapore was on a lockdown or a partial lockdown? I would suggest to you that she would have had a much worse time of it if she hadn't adapted. Okay, Charlotte, how can a business or how can an SME afford to adopt new digital technologies? Well, I would like to turn that question around and ask, how can an SME not afford to adopt new digital technologies, especially as we've just pointed out earlier, where an SME is much more nimble and therefore receptive to new technologies. I would encourage anyone who is an SME on this webinar today to really keep a finger on the pulse of new technologies as they become available, and to consider whether these technologies would be applicable to your business. The pandemic is just one catalyst of digital adoption, but were the pandemic not to occur, SMEs would nevertheless benefit, I think, from keeping themselves apprised of new technologies that become available, and by asking themselves whether or not these technologies could be applied to their business, to enhance their business, to make their businesses more efficient, to make their businesses more optimal in the ordinary course of affairs.
We also asked a question, an interesting one here that I'm not going to ask you to address directly. The question is, in regards to disruptive innovation, do you see any distinction between SMEs in the halal economy and conventional SMEs? And I guess the answer is probably not really. I mean, everyone currently, and wherever you are based, whatever type of business you are, whoever runs the business has to face the fact that innovation has to be embraced.
Yes, absolutely. I would echo that point, Charlotte. And the halal economy is an extraordinary business opportunity, of course. And this is a webinar organized by the World Islamic Economic Forum. But I don't think there's any difference between the halal economy any more than there is a difference between the education sector or the healthcare sector. At the end of the day, these technologies in and of themselves are neutral. Blockchain technologies can be applied to decentralized payment, but they can also be applied to halal certified supply chains, for example, and the verification of goods and ingredients along that supply chain. So I don't think the halal economy is any different than any other sectors. I think there would be applications of technologies that are peculiar to the halal economy, but that could be said of almost any other sector, Charlotte.
Another question going back to cryptocurrencies here. Could cryptocurrencies be legal payment in Indonesia, since the government legalized cryptocurrencies? And when we're talking about Indonesia here, we know that obviously Indonesia is very advanced when it comes to cryptocurrencies and in fintech generally. But what about the bigger picture? I mean, do you expect other governments out there to follow suit?
Well,
it's a very controversial topic at the moment.
So I'll give you the simple answer first, and we'll then go into a deeper analysis of the question. Now, the boring legal answer is that as at today, cryptocurrencies are not legal tender in Indonesia, nor in fact anywhere else. Indonesia regulates cryptocurrencies as they would any other commodity, such as gold or silver or nickel or iron ore or crude oil. All right. Could you make a purchase? Could you pay for your groceries using Bitcoin? Yes, well, you could, I suppose, in the same way that you could pay for your groceries using a little gold nugget. But these cryptocurrencies, like any other commodity, is not legal tender. Okay. Now, do I envisage a future where cryptocurrencies eventually do become legal tender? It's anybody's guess, really, and there are too many unknowns at the moment to make a call one way or another. Of course, it's quite a nice exercise to be able to imagine on one day where you'd be able to take out your cryptocurrency wallet and either using your, and use a balance of cryptocurrency in your Binance or your Toko crypto wallet to make purchases of groceries and other essential items. But it's not permissible certainly not in Indonesia today, and I think there's a lot of things that need to happen before they do, before a future such as I just described eventually comes to pass.
Yeah, I think I may have misread the question a little bit. Is obviously the Indonesian government legalized it as an investment.
Yes,
course.
That's right. So you can invest in cryptocurrencies in Indonesia today in the same way that you can invest in gold, but you wouldn't be able to use it as an instrument of payment.
Absolutely not, and we're not there yet.
We might be one day, but not today.
But that doesn't diminish the case for digital payments, of course. That's
Quite so.
We've got a couple more questions to address. They're tough ones because they're quite general questions to a certain extent. You know, one is, what does the future of innovation look like, especially considering the COVID-19 impact? And I think that would be a nice question to address to wrap up this discussion, maybe, okay, to talk about the disruptive innovations that have been key during this crisis and that probably have a bright future in terms of helping SMEs development.
Right. Sorry, could you repeat that question again? How? Yeah.
What does the future of innovation look like? And let's make it the future of innovation for SMEs.
The future of innovation for SMEs, I would suggest, is to have an open mind, I think. I think it would be unnecessarily narrowing the scope of the debate if we were to say the future of SMEs is in digital, or the future of SMEs is in blockchain, or the future of SMEs is in crypto. When we think of SMEs in Indonesia, and again, I would extend this to other developing markets in the world, we think of businesses that are small and perhaps not as well resourced as some of the large public companies or large and well-funded enterprises. We think perhaps of very traditional businesses serving the community, but there is no reason, Charlotte, why these businesses need to operate the same way year after year and decade after decade. We've already established quite early on that it costs these businesses very little to adopt new digital technologies, much less so than it would cost the bigger business. So really, the future of innovation for SMEs, I would suggest, is to continue to keep an open mind, is to continue to remain receptive to any new technologies that might come along, to continue to remain ready to adapt these technologies as and when it suits them, but rather than as a general rule, I mean, I would not follow any single trends in particular. I'm not about to suggest to you that AI or VR or blockchain or the crowd is the solution. But depending on what line of business you're in, any of these technologies, or some of these technologies, or perhaps none of these technologies might be available, might be applicable to your business. But as general advice to SMEs, I would suggest that you keep an open mind about these technologies.
Well, that's a great conclusion, isn't it? I think that before we talk about adopting those disruptive innovations, it's important to have this open mind, this agility, this flexibility, just to try something different and see if it works. I think that's the key, isn't it? Just explore when it comes to innovative technologies. And that's what disruption is all about. It's trying something new and something that has never been tried by others before, and see if it works for you. I mean, obviously every SME has different needs, so that's an important point as well, isn't it? You all have to try something that suits your needs, or just go out there and explore. Fantastic. Joel, thank you very much for being with us today. What a fascinating discussion. I think we could have been together for hours, really. There's so much to talk about.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Charlotte. The pleasure is mine. And thank you again to the World Islamic Economic Forum for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And back to our moderator. Have a fantastic day, everyone, or evening, wherever you're based.
Thank you all. That's all we have time for today's session. We truly hope that you've gained valuable input and will be beneficial to all. Thank you again to everyone for being here today and making this webinar successful.